Let's have a difficult conversation about who will die first after an SHTF event. And it's a difficult conversation because you or someone that you love might fall into one of the 6 categories of people that I'm going to describe, and the 5th group might offend some of you. This isn't hard to imagine. Take, for example, a coordinated electromagnetic pulse attack on the United States, where it hits the western United States and the eastern United States at the same time. The most immediate, most noticeable effect, of course, would be electricity going down, the grid collapsing, and entire cities plunging into darkness. Communication networks would fail, disrupting emergency services, causing widespread panic and confusion.
Martial law has been declared. Everything is under control.
The initial hours would be marked by a frantic struggle to understand the situation, with people seeking information and assistance. As days without power turn into weeks, the situation would worsen dramatically. Grocery stores would empty almost immediately. Critical infrastructure, including water treatment facilities, hospitals, and transportation systems, would stop functioning. The lack of refrigeration would lead to food spoilage, worsening food shortages. Generators would provide some with temporary relief, but fuel shortages would soon render them useless. Societal order would start to fray. Law enforcement and emergency services, they'd struggle to respond. And given enough time, those personnel probably wouldn't show up to work anyway, opting instead to stay at home and making sure that their loved ones are cared for and protected. Soon, looting and violence would increase as desperation set in. By the time weeks turn into months, the grim reality of a prolonged power outage would become evident. With supply chains disrupted, food and water scarcity would lead to widespread malnutrition and dehydration, increasing susceptibility to diseases. The absence of clean water results in outbreaks of waterborne illnesses. The psychological impact of a prolonged power outage and societal breakdown would be profound. Isolation, stress, anxiety, worry, it all have a serious impact on folks' mental health. Communities would fragment, trust would erode, and survival instincts would overtake societal norms. Amid the chaos, the death toll would rise dramatically, not just from direct causes like illness and violence, but also from the inability to access basic necessities. Certain populations would be disproportionately affected. These are the groups we're going to discuss. The funny thing is, while most of us are aware of this, we often imagine that we would be the exception to the norm, us and our loved ones. And if you watched my video on 5 harsh realities of life after SHTF, you'll know that most of us suffer from what's called optimism bias, and that can be a problem. But the truth is, as preppers, we have at least a little bit more reason to be optimistic about our chances of survival. After all, we are at least aware of the threats and working to address the threats. So that should increase our chances of surviving the threats. But nevertheless, many people will die and many preppers will perish. But who dies first? These are 6 groups that I've identified in order of those who I think are most likely to perish first. The first group of people who would perish would be the physically weak. And this is a diverse group of people whose commonality is their reliance on a finely balanced system of care and technology, both of which would be easily disrupted in a long-term collapse. First, consider the elderly. Many seniors rely on routine medical care and prescription medications to manage conditions like hypertension or diabetes. A breakdown in healthcare systems can cut off their access to life-sustaining drugs such as insulin, leaving them particularly vulnerable. Then there are those with mobility issues, whether due to disability or illness or injury. They could have a hard time escaping the initial event, and those first 24 hours are critical. Take, for example, somebody that is wheelchair bound. They may not be able to evacuate a dangerous situation as quickly as others would. They may find themselves unable to escape a building if the elevator is down or the hallways are filled with debris, or unable to escape a dangerous city if the wheelchair van driver doesn't show up for work. Children, and particularly toddlers, are also very vulnerable. They need near constant care, and their survivability is going to depend entirely on their parents, their caretakers, their guardians, level of personal preparedness, and ability to withstand a collapse. People with chronic conditions, such as those requiring dialysis, face a dire predicament when the electrical grid fails. Dead. Consider 2 individuals who depend on a steady supply of oxygen. These patients can find themselves in immediate distress when their oxygen concentrators stop working due to power outages. Dead. And let's not forget those with severe allergies or conditions like epilepsy who need immediate access to emergency medications like EpiPens or anti-seizure drugs to prevent life-threatening episodes. Possibly dead. Now, beyond common sense, there are plenty of historical examples where this has proven true. The aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in 2005 is an example where the frail and bedridden were left stranded in hospitals and nursing homes without power, water, or life-saving medical interventions. They were, in some cases, just abandoned. The 2010 Haiti earthquake unveiled another layer of harsh truth. Amidst the rubble, individuals with physical disabilities were often left behind during the frantic initial evacuation efforts. Those with visual and hearing impairments were unable to receive life-saving warnings and instructions. In the Great East Japan earthquake of 2011, the elderly faced insurmountable odds. The inability to swiftly evacuate due to physical frailty led to a significant number of casualties. The European heat wave in 2003 further illustrates the vulnerability of the physically weak during natural disasters. Around 30,000 people died during that heat wave, almost half of those in France alone. So what do you do if you or a loved one falls into this category? It's not like there's low incidence of chronic conditions or that we don't have an aging population. In fact, there are many what I would call silver preppers, seniors who prep. You have challenges ahead, there's no question about that, but there are steps that you can take to improve your odds of surviving a collapse. Build redundancy and stock extra supplies, medication or oxygen. Build a support network around yourself. As for children and toddlers, parents, their survival relies entirely on you, so make sure that you have a plan in place to care for them. And if you can't care for them, make sure you have somebody identified who can. Now, if history serves as any example, and often it does, business and political leaders might find themselves in a precarious situation after an SHTF event. Depending on the crisis at hand, the leaders might be some of the people that die next. They have the power in stable times, but they become targets when stability crumbles. Their decisions, alliances, and actions become scrutinized by people in heightened emotional states. And in the wake of a catastrophe, these leaders now have the dual challenge of both trying to manage the crisis and facing the outrage of the people. Times of crisis have precipitated some of the most dramatic shifts in political and business landscapes, often with violent outcomes for leaders. The assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC, an event that occurred amidst political chaos, is one of the earliest examples of how quickly leadership can be extinguished when discontent brews. Fast forward to the 20th century, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 triggered a chain of events leading to World War I, illustrating the geopolitical fragility and the personal risks for political figures. Post-World War II saw the Nuremberg trials and the removal of leaders who were deemed responsible for the conflict and its atrocities. More recently, the global financial crisis of 2008 resulted in the fall of Lehman Brothers and led to the vilification of CEOs considered responsible for the economic downturn. The Occupy Wall Street movement of 2011 was a direct response to this crisis, targeting economic inequality and the perceived greed of corporate leaders. You've heard the saying, "Eat the rich." People are upset with leaders today. Imagine the discontent and outrage at our leaders after an SHTF event, particularly if that event was caused by corporate or political mismanagement or corruption. Mob justice would be served on those in power. So what do you do if you're a business leader, politician, or government official? Well, you better have a solid bug-out plan in place. Maybe even a second passport. Make sure you have a plan to disappear. The next group of people who would face higher odds of dying would be those who resort to violence to survive, i.e., the violent. In the chaotic aftermath of a disaster, when law enforcement is stretched thin and a power vacuum emerges, there is a tendency for a certain segment of the population to turn to violence as a means of survival. This group may believe that by using force they can secure resources, assert control, or even establish a new order. We've all heard from these future aggressors in prepping circles, have we not? They're the ones who say, when the collapse hits, my survival plan is just to raid Walmart. They're the ones who say, all I need to do is stock up on guns and ammo and then I can take whatever else it is that I need. While some might find initial success using this approach, intimidation or even outright aggression, this is a survival plan that is fraught with danger for the perpetrators themselves. The cycle of violence in post-disaster environments is often self-perpetuating. Individuals or groups that resort to violence invite retribution and escalate tensions, which can lead to more widespread conflict. In the absence of a functioning legal system, justice becomes swift and brutal, and the lifespan of those who live by violence is drastically reduced. It's not hard to see how these aggressors often end up dead themselves. Live by the sword, die by the sword. Do it long enough and your luck will run out. Guaranteed. For example, during the French Revolution, the initial wave of violence against aristocracy soon spiraled into the Reign of Terror, where revolutionary leaders like Robespierre used violence to consolidate power. This strategy ultimately backfired, leading to Robespierre's own execution. The Bosnian War after the breakup of Yugoslavia in the early 1990s also demonstrates the risks of resorting to violence in power vacuums. The initial aggressors often became targets in the ensuing ethnic conflicts. My advice is that if you are in that I'll just take what it is that I need group, that you think again. You might have all of the tactical gear and Kevlar vests and night vision equipment and high capacity magazines, but so do a lot of other people. You might be able to shoot your way through the first few encounters, but eventually, Grandpa's going to take you out with his old lever-action 30-30. Violence is not a survival plan, it's a death plan. The next group of people who will die first will be the isolated, and that's not just physical isolation, but psychological isolation as well. Isolation includes not just the lone wolf who is intending to survive in a very remote area, but also those who might be in bustling urban centers but lack the social support systems of friends, family, and community. Isolation, while in the beginning phases of a crisis might be advantageous, the more the time goes on, the more it becomes a disadvantage. You need the ability to exchange aid, information, and support, goods and services. And the longer the crisis goes on, the harder it gets for those who are isolated. Again, history has shown that those who are isolated often fare worse in a crisis. During the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, rural communities with limited access to medical care and current information suffered higher mortality rates. Similarly, in urban settings, the elderly and infirm who lived alone faced more significant challenges without a support system to help them access treatment. The Great Blizzard of 1978 in the northeastern United States left many people stranded in their homes, but the toll was heaviest on those living alone who could not reach out for help. 2011 Thailand floods. Those who lived alone or in remote communities were particularly affected. With the relief efforts strained, these individuals had fewer means to call for help and were often overlooked in favor of more accessible populated areas. For those at risk of being isolated in a crisis, proactive planning is key. You need to build that support network. We often find connection through mobile devices like our smartphones or our computers, but this is an illusion when it comes to connectedness, real connectedness. You need people in your life, friends and family who are nearby and can be physically present in the time of a crisis. Now this next category might offend some of you. It certainly offended my wife. I call it the mentally weak. She asked me about the video that I'm making and I told her it was about those who die first in an SHTF event, and she said that will be me. I said I have 6 categories of people. And she said, which category do I fall into? And I said the mentally weak.
I am not mentally weak,
She said. It probably wasn't the best answer, but hear me out. By mentally weak, I'm talking about those who make a conscious decision to check out. She's alluded to this before, and I'm sure you know many people who have alluded to it before, and plenty of people comment on my social media posts saying I'd rather not live in such an environment. Living in a hell, fear of starvation, and wondering what threat is just around the corner. My wife's argument is that it's actually mentally stronger to make the call and say, I'm out of here. I mean, who wants to watch society unravel and people turn into savages? I'm sure there's not a lot of joy to be found in such a world, and I'm not even really sure what prompts me to want to survive in that environment, whether it's just survival instinct or just a morbid curiosity to see how it all unfolds. So I'm not sure if mentally weak is the right phrase to call this group. Maybe they are mentally stronger, making a conscious decision to say, I'm out of here. Maybe they're the smart ones. I don't know. But if there's a better way to describe this group that you can think of, let me know in the comments section. And let me know if you are one of these mentally weak folks or whether you think it's actually mentally stronger. Either way, in the aftermath of societal collapse, mental resilience becomes as critical as physical endurance. Those who find it challenging to cope with the extreme stress, anxiety, and the psychological toll that such catastrophic events can impose may just decide the best option is checking out. And trying to survive any post-collapse environment is certainly going to exacerbate problems for those who already have mental health challenges. The siege of Leningrad during World War II, which lasted over 2 years, is a prime example where the mental strain on the city's inhabitants was as lethal as the famine and cold. The prolonged stress and trauma led to a breakdown in social order and instances of extreme desperation. During the Rwandan genocide, the psychological scars left on survivors have been deep and enduring. The mental resilience required to survive such an ordeal was immense, and many struggled with the long-term health consequences of such trauma. However you describe this group, they're not going to make it. They'll either crack under the trauma and go insane, or they'll just make the rational decision to check out. This last group of people describes both non-preppers and those who are just struggling to get by. It's the unprepared. In a severe crisis, the disparity between those with ample resources and those without becomes very evident. And ample resources are not just financial resources, but also food, water, and shelter. Those without resources can include those living in poverty, the homeless, and even some middle-class families who are living beyond their means without anything to show for it. Frankly, it could also include some of the well-off. Granted, in a long-term SHTF TEOTWAWKI type situation, the value of the dollar, your 401k, your crypto portfolio, that is likely to all become worthless. But those resources can prove pivotal in the beginning of a crisis. They allow you to have some options. And the vulnerability of those without resources in times of crises is a recurring theme in history. During the 1930s, the Dust Bowl compounded the misery of the Great Depression as impoverished farmers faced the loss of their lands and livelihoods, leading to widespread displacement known as the Dust Bowl migration. In the prelude to World War II, the Jewish populations in Europe were increasingly marginalized and stripped of their resources. Those with the financial means and foresight managed to emigrate and avoid the horrors of the Holocaust, while many who lacked resources or whose assets were seized were left extremely vulnerable to the ensuing genocide. The impact of Hurricane Katrina in 2005 also illustrates this divide. The wealthy managed to evacuate New Orleans promptly, while many of the city's poorest residents, without the means to leave, endured the worst of the storm's aftermath, trapped in the Superdome without access to basic necessities. It's not just financial resources, though. It also includes supplies, know-how, and skills. After all, you could be a tech billionaire without the basics to survive a 72-hour emergency, no idea on how to defend yourself, or what to do in a time of crisis. Now, if you're not one of the other tech billionaires who's buying up real estate in New Zealand, building your own airstrip and a bunker to survive the end of days, you still have options. Prepping can seem daunting to those who are financially strapped, but incremental steps make a difference. They add up over time. Knowledge is power. You're watching this video after all, and you've subscribed to my channel, of course, right? You're stocking water, food, and equipment to survive, and often that will get you through the first and sometimes even the second phase of a post-collapse event, and that will dramatically increase your odds of survival. Given enough time, systems will re-emerge. People will eventually come together in some fashion. Economies and trade will re-emerge, and if you can get to that stage after an SHTF event, you'll be well positioned to keep on keeping on. You need to do more than just stock rice and beans, though that is a good start. You need to learn some skills. And remember the golden rule in prepping: 2 is 1 and 1 is none. Build systems of redundancy. Keep educating yourself, keep prepping. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst.